Professor Bajpai, day after tomorrow, Friday the 23rd, the Prime Minister will visit the Ukraine for 8 hours. In the present circumstances, is this a wise and thoughtful step or an ill-considered and mistaken one?
No, it's a good step. I think it's consistent with what New Delhi has been saying since the Russians went into the Ukraine in February of 2022. And it makes sense. It makes sense because the war has constrained or brought costs to India in various ways, not the least of which is an awkward diplomatic situation that you gestured at in your remarks between the United States and friendly Western countries to India and Russia on the other hand. So I think, in a sense, there has to be a bit of balancing. And the Prime Minister met Putin recently and has been quite friendly there. And I think he has to show a certain degree of kind of balance. Call it non-alignment, call it strategic autonomy. I think that's quite warranted.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Day after tomorrow, on Friday the 23rd, the Prime Minister will visit the Ukraine. But why is he going? What can the visit achieve? And is this to appease Western pressure after his controversially timed visit to Moscow in July? How will the Biden administration view the visit? And what will President Putin make of it? Those are the key issues I shall raise today, and joining me to help answer them is the Wilmer Professor of Asian Studies at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore, Kanti Bajpai. Professor Bajpai, day after tomorrow, Friday the 23rd, the Prime Minister will visit the Ukraine for 8 hours. In the present circumstances, is this a wise and thoughtful step or an ill-considered and mistaken one?
No, it's a good step. I think it's consistent with what New Delhi has been saying since the Russians went into the Ukraine in February of 2022. And it makes sense. It makes sense because the war has constrained or brought costs to India in various ways, not the least of which is an awkward diplomatic situation that you gestured at in your remarks between the United States and friendly Western countries to India and Russia on the other hand. So I think, in a sense, there has to be a bit of balancing. And the Prime Minister met Putin recently and has been quite friendly there. And I think he has to show a certain degree of kind of balance. Call it non-alignment, call it strategic autonomy. I think that's quite warranted. We have interests on both sides, very strong ones. In fact, they're almost identical. And maybe we want to pursue that. But our interests in a good relationship with Russia are rather similar to our interest in a good relationship with the United States in a very material way and diplomatic way as well.
Many people believe that Prime Minister Modi is only visiting Kyiv because of sharp criticism from America of his visit to Moscow in July and his bear hug with President Putin, which coincided with the NATO summit in Washington and a Russian attack on a children's hospital in Ukraine, which killed 37. Is this a gesture to appease pressure from the West?
I don't think so. I mean, a cynic would say that, but I think a better sense of it is that this is kind of non-alignment and strategic autonomy, which India has practiced for a very long time between the two sides. And that makes perfect sense. Between the two, we've cast our lot with neither side consistently. We are pushed by our interests. And let's tick some of those interests off. With the Russians, we essentially have three. One, for the China relationship. We want to make sure that Moscow doesn't drift too close to China, so we remain friendly on that count. We import energy, more so since, of course, the invasion of the Ukraine. And the most important thing is the import of arms. Notice that those are exactly the things that draw us to the Americans and the Western powers, but particularly the Americans. We turn to the Americans for some comfort against China. We import increasingly, we import arms from the Americans. We import about 60 billion from the Russians and about 20 billion over the last 20 years from the United States. That's no small amount, even though it's smaller than what we get from Moscow. And we increasingly import energy from America. In the basket of goods that we import from the Americans, our defense imports are the fourth largest of the things we buy from America, and oil and energy imports are the fifth. So, it's not an exact balance between the two in terms of what we import and what we expect, but there are very similar interests pushing our relationship with both sides. And I think surely this is a signal by New Delhi that it wants to maintain a kind of appropriate balance between the two sides.
Except let me remind you what the United States said multiple times after Prime Minister Modi visited Moscow in July. Donald Lu talked about America's disappointment. The State Department's official spokesman said that he was concerned about India's relationship with Russia. Eric Garcetti, the American ambassador in Delhi, said the United States cannot be taken for granted. Our own PTI said there was outrage in the West, and the Hindu said that there were weeks of bitter criticism. You're saying to me that none of this has actually influenced the Prime Minister's decision to go to the Ukraine, something he hadn't thought of doing for the last 2.5 years.
Well, he may have. We don't know whether he did think of it earlier and whether it was appropriate. By the way, he's going to Poland as well. So, it's not
Probably that's
just.
a stepping stone to Ukraine and nothing
Well,
more.
fair enough. But I mean, you've got to dress it up one way or the other. And Poland is quite an important country in Europe for other reasons. But it makes sense. The Americans are going to be upset over these things that we're doing with the Russians. So are the Russians going to be a bit upset that we're close to the Americans. And I think New Delhi and Mr. Modi are doing the right thing. I don't always agree with everything India's foreign policy does, but on this, it seems to make a lot of sense. I think part of it is this, that apart from these kind of, just balance for the sake of balance, what I'm trying to suggest is that there are hard material and other reasons for the balance. It's not simply to show that, virtue signaling, that, we're kind of even-handed, we don't throw in our lot permanently with one side or the other. I mean, there are very strong reasons to tilt or do business with the Russians on one hand and maintain the option of doing it with the other side. And the American reaction, of course, publicly, they've got to make some gestures towards criticizing us. But privately, we can see a lot of businesses happening nonetheless. And there are difficulties on both sides. We over-romanticize the relationship with Moscow as if there are no problems there. But privately and publicly over 5 decades, we've had significant problems with the Russians without torpedoing the relationship with them. So I think, let's not exaggerate these statements by the Americans. They've got to do them pro forma as much as New Delhi has to make statements pro forma from time to time.
Let me quote to you what former Foreign Secretary Krishna Srinivasan said to me about 10 days ago. He said the visit would be a mistake. He said it will look as if we are buckling under pressure. You, I take it, very strongly disagree.
Yeah, I strongly disagree. I've just outlined all the kinds of material reasons for maintaining a balance, which are important for Indian interests. The United States does become a comfort to us against the Chinese. We import arms. We do all kinds of other military things with them. And we buy energy and other products from them that are important to us. Likewise, those are exactly the things that we value with the Russians. It's canny of us and shrewd of us to be able to do business with both sides and reap advantages from both. I remember back in the Cold War, an economist in Britain said about it, I think it was Kalecki, who said, non-alignment is basically milking two cows. And Mr. Modi may not be able to utter the words non-alignment because he thinks it's, identified with the Communist Party. But in fact, I mean, that's what Indian policy is. And you might say it's non-alignment plus a little bit more muscularity given our economy and our military capabilities. But we're milking both cows. And that's not the only thing that non-alignment is, but it's a good part of non-alignment.
Let me quote what President Zelensky said when Prime Minister Modi visited Moscow in July and bear-hugged President Putin. His exact words were, "It is a huge disappointment and a devastating blow to peace efforts to see the leader of the world's largest democracy hug the world's most bloody criminal in Moscow on such a day." And that day was the precise day that the Russians bombed a children's hospital in Ukraine, killing 37. After that comment just 6 weeks ago, what sort of reception will Modi get in Kyiv?
Well, the fact that he's going suggests that he will get a pretty good reception. Kyiv needs all the friends it can get, and it wants to ensure that a country as big as India will, maintain some degree of kind of sort of a positive relationship with the Ukraine, that we won't go over completely to the other side. I mean, we're 1.4 coming on to 1.5 billion people, and you don't want a country as large as India being completely opposed to you. So whatever he may have said in the moment, about India and our policies in that emotional moment when that strike occurred, it's another thing to then, with some time, receive Modi and show that you can do business. He has to demonstrate, Zelensky, that he's also a hard-headed geopolitical strategist. And I think from that perspective, India is important. Also, I mean, why give up on the idea that India could be some kind of another channel to Moscow?
Well, I'll come to that in a moment's time. Let me ask you one more question, this time about the timing of the visit. It happens after Ukraine has captured 1,263 square kilometers of Russian territory. I'm quoting the Ukrainian Chief of Army Staff. And according to yesterday's Financial Times, Zelensky has told the paper that he wants to convert this 1,263 square miles into a buffer zone. Standing in Kyiv, Modi can't speak against this, but equally, Moscow would be very upset if he doesn't. How tricky will that be?
Will be tricky, but I mean, I wouldn't underestimate, the Ministry of External Affairs in this regard. I mean, these things happen. There will be the war is 2 years old, and it's going to carry on for a while. There are going to be awkward moments for all parties, including India. And I think that while he's there, we'll make the appropriate noises without offending Putin too much. And I think, a very hard-headed calculation. Their control over this.
Can I interrupt? You're saying that while we're there, we can make the appropriate noises without offending Putin too much. In other words, we can strike that happy middle note. You confident we can do it? You confident it'll work with Zelensky because he presumably perceives us as allied with the Russians?
Well, I mean, it's never good to answer a question with a question, but why is he hosting Modi? I mean, he's not going to throw egg in his face when he arrives. And when he's there, he's looking for a certain degree of diplomatic contact and bridge building. So he'll be careful as well. And by the way, I mean, from a very hard-headed point of view, the Ukrainian incursion into Russia, let's see how that plays out. But it may make Moscow think about moving towards some kind of a peace deal, or at least a ceasefire.
You don't think the timing is awkward because of that incursion? That's the precise.
Karan, the timings are going to be always awkward. There's always going to be something that pops up that makes the timing awkward. So I think, at some point, you just have to power through. And I think that's what Modi and Indian diplomacy has decided to do. Just power through and tough it out and make sure that you do a good job while you're there. And I think, it'll be all right. I'm confident that they can manage this. I mean, they would have laid the groundwork in any case before Modi arrives there to ensure that nothing very untoward happens. And I can't see why it would be in Zelensky's interest to embarrass Modi on the ground, after he receives him. So I respect Mr. Srinivas, but I don't see this as a huge mistake and a risk.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Let's move beyond the question why this visit is happening, and let me ask you what purpose it can serve. The Indian Express, after a briefing by the Ministry of External Affairs, says New Delhi is willing to contribute in finding a peaceful solution to the conflict. Given that India has never criticized Russia's invasion and is a major purchaser of Russian oil, which keeps the Russian economy afloat, can we contribute to a peaceful solution? Are we not, and I'm repeating what I said earlier, perceived to be too much on Russia's side to be genuinely, objectively neutral and acceptable to the Ukraine? Zelensky might welcome a visit because we represent the global south, because we represent 1.4 billion. But would he welcome India trying to mediate between the two?
Yeah, I mean, I think he'd welcome anyone trying to mediate. We've seen the Ukrainians under intense military pressure the last few months, this recent breakout notwithstanding. And by the way, let's see how long that can be sustained, because when you break into someone else's territory, you have enormous supply lines that you have to maintain and so on. So that may not last very long. So he knows that, in the long term, Russia's enormous capacities will begin to tell. He has to get a ceasefire, at least as breathing room, if not a peace deal. And why not reach out to India and the global south to try and help? Now, can India do very much? I mean, the very fact that India has equities with Putin is helpful in mediating. If India was so strictly neutral and had no real leverage or capital to draw on with Putin, what use would we be, frankly? So,
At the moment, can I interrupt? We're not even successful in getting back the Indians who have gone and joined the Russian army, despite promises personally made by Putin, which have never been corroborated by the Russian side publicly, but we believe that personal promises were made by Putin. Those Indians, perhaps as many as 70 or 80, fighting for the Russian army and getting killed, are not being sent back. We've heard nothing more about it, and 6 weeks have passed since the visit.
Yeah, I mean, it is a difficult situation, and I feel for those people and their families, but there are much bigger stakes. I mean, we have to be a bit cold-eyed about it. And there are much bigger stakes for India in managing the relationship with Russia, with China, the United States, and seeing, certain developments in Europe that are not really great for India in the long run. I think a war in that zone, Ukraine is not a small country. It's one of the biggest countries in Europe. And for it to be in turmoil on the lip of Western Europe and, Russia, it's a very pivotal spot. And there are all kinds of reasons we should be worried about a long-term war there. So I think if India can play a role, I don't want to exaggerate it, but if India can, then all to the good. And I think Zelensky will be looking for whoever he can line up. By the way, it makes sense for him to invite Modi over to signal to the Russians that, he has an ability to kind of attract diplomatic support from all kinds of places. And I think New Delhi has an interest in some signaling to Moscow that Moscow shouldn't take it for granted either. Just like we often signal to the Americans that don't take us for granted beyond a point. That's the kind of position India has occupied for 60 years, and it's a pretty good position.
Razaul Laskar, the foreign editor of the Hindustan Times, in an article that he wrote yesterday, which was both on the front page and on inside pages in the paper, has written, and I'm quoting him, the Indian side is not keen on direct mediatory roles, but has instead indicated that it can pass messages between the two sides. If that's accurate, how do you view this role as a sort of go-between or even a courier?
Well, I mean, we're masters at it, going back to the original Cold War. I mean, we warned the Americans that the Chinese were going to cross the Yalu against American and Korean forces in 1950. The Americans didn't listen to us, but that's another matter. So we've been a go-between on in many cases, and I think that's the lowest level mediatory input that you can have. And I think if that works, then let's make a beginning there. And it's an honorable role. There's nothing wrong with it.
There's
If that's
one
the role,
difference. There's one difference, isn't there, Professor Bajpai, between the 1950s and the Korean War of that time and today? Today, we want to be recognized as a great power. We're seeking permanent membership of the Security Council. Will the role of a carrier of messages add to India's stature or detract from it?
I mean, it may not, add to it massively, but it's an honorable, sensible role. And after all, it may enhance our claims, if anything, for membership to be seen to be a good officers kind of entity. There's not, I mean, I think we exaggerate our role as a great power. We are rising, our capabilities are enhanced, but let's just take stock. I mean, in 1960, India had 2.5% of global GDP in nominal terms. Today, it has 3.5%. That's not an enormous rise relative to other countries. We're still a kind of a middle power, whatever the Indian government may say. And that's exactly what middle powers do. We're one of the biggest middle powers. But, like the middle classes, we're a conduit between the upper classes and the somewhat more subaltern classes. A middle power is a conduit between the biggest powers and the somewhat smaller powers. And it's a perfectly appropriate and honorable role. It doesn't make us any the less. We have credibility with the big powers, and we represent and have links to smaller powers. That's what middle powers do. And that's where we're placed.
The other issue is how will President Putin view Narendra Modi's visit to Kyiv, and perhaps more importantly, how will he view India seeking to play the role of a go-between? Would he be happy, A, that the Prime Minister is going to Kyiv? And secondly, would he be happy for the Prime Minister or for the Indian government to act as a go-between? Because go-betweens have to be neutral to be credible.
Well, I mean, there's neutrality and there's neutrality. So you have to have some equities with various partners in order to be and you don't have to be strictly neutral to be, a good go-between. But, Putin is a cold-eyed guy from the intelligence services. He doesn't take offense very easily. And he knows that India's got its own concerns. And he values the India relationship partly because he needs some bargaining room with China as well. So a relationship with India is important for that reason. And it's important because they sell us stuff and he makes dollars off us. So, or rupees or whatever the terms of trade are now to deal with the sanctions problem. But, we have equities with the Russians and leverage with them. And so we have to, I think, hang tough, whatever Putin may feel. But Putin, I think, will understand that India, to be useful to him, has to play, kind of a middle ground role. He can't seriously expect Delhi to jump over completely to his side in a situation where India is geopolitically placed where it is and has a problem with China. So, and if India can be helpful in resolving the problem with the Ukraine at some stage, then so much to the good. I don't think Putin is a man who just gets up and will weep over a few statements or moves by India. He'll look at the bigger picture with India and factor that in. And in the bigger picture, going to the Ukraine and hugging Zelensky on the tarmac is not going to make Putin lose too much sleep.
Now, you're a professor of Asian studies, so let me ask you, how will all of this be viewed by the global South? India seeks to present itself both as the leader, but also as the voice of the South. How will the role of a go-between be viewed in Pretoria, Brasilia, Beijing, Riyadh?
Well, I think they're all pretty much in the same position as India is, and would all like maneuvering room, both with the Russians and the Americans and the Western powers, and a resolution of the Ukraine eventually would be great. If India can play a small role towards articulating a position that's somewhere between the Russians, the Ukrainians, and the Americans, I think that's good. I think the global South would recognize that India has a role. India's diplomats are quite famous for being adept at this kind of role as well. So, I mean, what's for the global South to be annoyed about? I think they'd be fine with India's role.
Finally, because we're coming towards the end of this interview, we Americans, regardless of what you've been saying to me in this interview, but the Americans will believe that this visit is a response to their criticism and to the pressure that they brought to bear. And it's no hiding the fact that they've been openly talking that they have put pressure on Modi to go to Kyiv. Now that he's visiting Kyiv, will that strengthen the relationship with Washington, or might it suggest to the Biden administration that India can be made to do things it initially doesn't want to do?
Well, I mean, you've got to give a kind of quasi-ally or partner something occasionally as well. So if the Americans tick this off as a little bit of a diplomatic victory for them, excellent. I mean, I think Modi is happy to give them that little positive, that little tick. And just as much as we give the Russian, some tick marks by visiting them and closing our mouths over certain things that the Russians do. So it's not a bad thing if you're seeking strategic autonomy. Strategic autonomy means doing what you want to do, and that might include occasionally doing something nice for partners that put some pressure on you without completely collapsing. And I don't see where India has completely given in to the Americans or the Russians on anything. And so, yeah, you've got to give your strategic partners a sense that sometimes you're amenable to their way of thinking. And I think that's what we've probably done, and that's about enough. I mean, let's not exaggerate our role. And whether we embrace the Russians on this or embrace the Ukrainians is not really going to be utterly decisive. Everyone knows it. But some of these small gestures, I think are fine. The Americans will swallow hard. They've got other things to worry about. And if this looks like we've made a little bit of a concession to Washington, as much as we make concessions to Russia, I think that'll keep everyone in good humor. I'm not worried about it. I don't know why people are getting into a little bit of a hissy fit over Modi going to the Ukraine. I think that's exactly what we've been aiming to do for some time, and this was about the right time to do it.
One last question. If this visit is perceived to be happening under pressure from the West, then how do you see India's relationship with Moscow in the months and years ahead? What sort of influence could Washington hope to exercise over that relationship? Because having done it once, they might believe they can do it repeatedly thereafter.
Yeah, I mean, you have to worry about the slippery slope and all of that. If you give in to one thing, then will you give in on everything? I think 60 years of Indian diplomacy or more now, 70 years, shows that we don't give in on everything to anyone. It makes us awkward for others, and that's all right. Sometimes being awkward and sticking to your guns is important. I don't think Washington, by any stretch of the imagination, can calculate that because Modi showed up in Kyiv, that he will therefore now jump over and jump over every hoop that Washington presents. Nor will likewise, nor will Putin have to draw the conclusion that just because he went to Kyiv, that Modi now has jumped over to the American side and won't do business. There are hard interests and advantages in Moscow and Washington, which transcend just this Ukrainian issue. And they call China, they call selling arms, they call selling oil. And these should not be lost sight of. Yeah, it isn't just Ukraine, non-alignment and strategic autonomy. There are reasons to do business with both, and both our partners will swallow hard occasionally when we do things that they don't like because there are those other interests.
Professor Bajpai, thank you very much for the time you've given to me. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.